Okay, so a couple things to get started today. One of you made an appointment to see me earlier and I missed it. I very much apologize for that. I'll try to catch up with you again soon. But we're going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to give you the code for attendance, which today is 5826. 5826. So, and keep those devices out because we're also going to do, after you get logged in, I want you to do the trace evaluation for the course as well. We can just get that out of the way. So it shouldn't take more than like 5 or 10 minutes, I would think. I've never done one. So the opportunity to do the trace evaluation is a great one. You can summon up all of the terrible things about this class, its instruction, its content, and you can put them all down in one place, okay? It is important to do these trace evaluations because they really do supply excellent feedback that I've used to modify the course for future groups. Come on in, folks. The code is 5826. And we're doing the trace evaluation for the class right now. The last time I taught this class, I had 300 students in here, and the university New Wave Wi-Fi went out on the day that we were supposed to do the trace evaluation. So thankfully, that's not the case today. This is the one moment when you can get feedback like in real time, and it's a trace evaluation is just our course evaluation platform. Yeah. It's better because that way. One thing that would be great to talk with you about in the future is we've been talking all semester about how awful the Blackboard software system is, and it's truly epically bad. It's bad at every turn. But I really want to do a kind of like get some real software design experts and do a side-by-side comparison of like really crappy software versus super excellent intuitive software, because it's like night and day. So I think that'll be. Yes. Say the code again. Yes, 5826. 5826. And then we're also doing the trace evaluation. So if you could jump on the trace evaluation, I would appreciate it. Yeah. Correct. 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 You're correct. And I'm sure we'll have plenty already. We've got 182 people. I'm sure we'll have plenty to choose from. However, that is a design flaw in the syllabus. And duly noted, all right? Yes, Fawaz, yes. Say it again. Not this coming Thursday, the 1st, no. Well, the Thursday after, we're not in class. No. The presentations will be on the 1st, which is this coming Thursday, the day that the projects are due, as has been pointed out by my associate in the front row here, that in fact, the best way to have done this would have been to have them due the day before, and the presentations on, this is fully noted. Gentlemen, thanks for coming. The code is 5826, and we're doing the trace evaluation. Maybe somebody can give me some kind of idea when we're going to be done with the trace evaluation. I don't know how long it takes. Yeah, so you get to it via MyNEU, I think, correct? You guys have all done trace evaluations before? Right. Unfortunately, I see the world from the faculty portals and never from the students, so I don't really know. But Malika, that's right, isn't it? That they go through my NEU to do their trace evaluation? Hmm? Okay, do I have to do something to send that link to them? Oh, okay. Okay, okay, okay. So is anybody having trouble accessing the trace thing right now? No, okay. We don't normally have this much downtime, but I needed to get this out of control. If you're looking for good vocabulary to use about your instructor, words like spellbinding, fabulous, outstanding, best I've ever had, those are all acceptable answers. So how are we doing? How much more time do we need, do you think? 5 more minutes? Okay, perfect. Do you want power?
No, I just want to review this thing while I.
Oh, okay, yeah, good. Yeah, now, see, now I can.
So yeah, this is stuff we know. This is our mission.
This is so great.
The premise that is based a lot on systems theory and understanding that the interaction of these systems is as much contributing to structural inequality in the country. So our goal is to understand across the systems in which China interact, and then design at this altitude to change the system. So we have no clients. We serve the people, and we design our own projects. So, as I stated already, this is our goal. But what we're trying to do is use design to basically change.
So do you see?
So we are our
Okay, can we, is it okay if we get going now? You going to be able to finish your trace things? Why don't we let them maybe even overlap for just a minute? But I do want to get to our guest, so I'm going to get us started. Our guest today is Jason Lee, who uses design thinking to address social issues, which is something we haven't really broached so much. And I think this is going to be a great segue into our final guest next Monday, Joseph Aoun. So Jason's firm, Agency, believes that design can be a powerful tool to reduce structural inequalities in this country. He aims to develop new design methods for this age of complex systems and enact positive social change. Previously, Jason worked for 3 years at Continuum, where our first guest, Lee Moreau, also works, an international design and innovation company, on projects ranging from the future of first response to the future of senior housing. Prior to that, he practiced as an architect and urban designer for 8 years at Die Architekten CIE, an acclaimed Dutch social housing and sustainable urban design firm executing projects on 5 continents. From 2005 to 2008, he lived in Shanghai, where as a director of the firm, he opened the branch office and oversaw all Asian projects for Architekten CIE. Jason has taught architecture and urban design at Illinois Institute of Technology, here at Northeastern, and at the Berlage Institute in the Netherlands. He has been a guest critic at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, MIT, Northeastern, the Berlage Institute, TU Delft, Rietveld Academy, among many others. His work and writing have appeared in Monu, Conditions, A+U, C3, and several other books and publications. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from McGill University and a Master of Architecture from the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Jason Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, George. I didn't actually expect you to read my entire LinkedIn profile. So you guys got a lot more information than I was expecting. But thank you very much for having me in your class, and I hope you guys had an awesome Thanksgiving weekend. So yeah, as George mentioned, my name is Jason Lee. I'm trained as an architect. I have an undergrad in anthropology, but my master's degree is in architecture. And I like to think of the work that I'm doing now as kind of actually blending those two realms pretty seamlessly. So as George mentioned, for about 10 years I did architecture and urban design, predominantly in Europe and Asia, working on really little things like restorations of old bridges and transforming them into restaurants, to giant Korean housing projects for the government there. Also different urban planning projects all over the place. And that was great. That was really fun. As an architect, you get to do that awesome work that's really between sort of vision and implementation. You know, you're not actually building anything. You're just drawing things so that other people can build things. And that's super rewarding because it's like this sort of complex puzzle solving. But at a certain point, it also becomes a little bit frustrating because you don't get a seat at the table for the really big decisions. Like, hey, should we even make this building? Or does the road need to go this way, or should it go a different way? And so, you start to move towards that when you do urban design, but really a lot of those decisions are already baked in. And after 10 years of practicing architecture and urban design all over the place, that was the reason why I switched and jumped to Continuum, for the promise of working at a more strategic level, working with clients to figure out, predominantly corporate clients, but with them to figure out, what is the right question to ask, and then what would the right solution be to that question. So in my time at Continuum, I worked on, as George mentioned, a bunch of really interesting things, including thinking about the future of first response from a really holistic level for the Department of Homeland Security. So we're looking at fire, police, and EMT, engaging with the DHS for about a year and a half, running a series of workshops with first responders from across the country, doing all kinds of really interesting work, and developing solutions, or potential solutions, ideas for solutions that hopefully the DHS would latch onto, and then eventually the federal government would take up as well. I also did stuff like working on new models for urban housing for seniors. As we know, sort of the population in America is aging, particularly in urban centers, and so we worked very closely with a nonprofit housing corporation out in California, in Southern California, to develop a market solution. So I don't know if any of your, I guess it would be grandparents probably. It'd be my parents, but your grandparents are living in Florida in these kind of gated, sequestered communities. That model is sort of run its course, and this nonprofit was interested in developing one that could actually contribute back to the city. And that's really exciting. And then the other kind of work we do is also just sort of pure fantastical visioning work, where we really think broadly using all of the expertise that Continuum had, expertise and knowledge that Continuum had accrued over a long time of doing human-centered design to understand and project forward into the future, what life might be like for, in this case, millennials interested in living in Boston, and what kind of city and place Boston would be like in the future. So yeah, at Continuum, the focus is really on human-centered design. So if as an architect and an urban planner, you're really dealing with financial constraints, sort of geospatial constraints, building constraints, you're interacting predominantly with, I'd say, documents that tell you how and what you're supposed to do. Continuum's approach is very different in that if you were here for a Lee Moreau's lecture, it's a human-centered approach. And they start with this idea of a design ethnography. And out of a design ethnography, this idea that you can actually have a productive conversation with somebody in their home about whatever it is that they're interested in, that will really inform your first design move, and then eventually the strategies and whatnot that you're going to develop. So those are the sort of two halves of my background. And that led to the formation of Agency. About, almost 9 months ago now, we started Agency. So Agency is a nonprofit design consultancy, and we're focused on the social innovation space. In specific, but also in extremely large terms, we aim to eradicate structural inequality in this country. So this is our mission. So, when you do human-centered design, which is really, really fun and really, really rewarding, at a certain point what you realize is that you're designing for a very large but specific segment of the population. Human-centered design is really focused on developing insights from people, but more specifically from consumers. So in your capacity as a consumer to be able to have more purchasing power to go out and buy more stuff, that's where human-centered design is really focused. And so, it's shaping and reshaping the world for already, tremendously advantaged people. And at a certain point, you start to feel like this model of a consultancy is perpetuating structural inequalities in the country just by virtue of the work that it does. So our mission is to focus on this stuff. And a big part of making that shift, or trying to understand how to undo or reduce structural inequalities in America in specific, are about acknowledging the sort of the current situation. Understanding the present. Times are no longer as they were. It's not the 1860s. We're not, it's not little mill towns in New England. It's a very different place. Whether it's political, economic, social, or technological, we're kind of surrounded by and embedded in and enmeshed in mature systems, and in some cases, like decaying systems. Think about our highway and railroad infrastructure. I mean, these are systems that were, from the future, top of the line, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, and now they're in a serious state of disrepair and in need of trillions of dollars of repair and renovation. So another way to visualize these systems could be like this. So one thing that's, I think, important to note about things like education, healthcare, media, and transportation, just as very broad, large systems that the country is sort of composed of, is that they're not really designed from the perspective of the human experience. So, you have to imagine that when, for example, transportation, when the road networks were designed, they were really designed to accommodate the car or the horse, but probably the car and the train, which sort of perpetuated the need for the scale of transportation and organization that came out of that. They weren't really designed for the perspective of the human. So this alone is like a huge opportunity. And then in addition to that, each system has its points of inflection and leverage, which are unique and which can have a multiplier effect when we start to manipulate them a little bit. So our goal is to sort of look across where all these different systems intersect and interact, and try to figure out how each system can affect the one next to it. So another way of thinking about it is that we design the problem, and we also draw the boundary around the system that we're looking at. In order to do this kind of work, we have to basically operate at a slightly different altitude. We need to be connectors. We're trying to look across organizations, across silos, and across systems, and sort of looking at them from a position of remove. We believe that all the people that we work with in all of the great organizations that we are partnered with are necessary for change, but they're kind of ill-equipped or sometimes unable to affect a systemic solution. So the reason that is because system players, in other words, people who, let's say, work in the MBTA, are motivated by entrenched interest, historical measures, politics, and their own need for job security, which is a totally respectable and honorable thing to be looking out for. So what we imagine is that to make change, we need to bring multiple players together so that we can leverage their collective knowledge, their will, their insight, and their resources. So, we're a consulting firm, but we use that term loosely because we design our own projects. And that's how we want to shape the work. So we have no clients, we serve the people directly. As I was sort of saying to George when I came up here, one of the things that's fundamentally different about our business is that, well, number one, we're a nonprofit design consultancy, of which there aren't really that many. Secondly, our goal is to think of the people who pay for our work not as clients, but as funders. So currently we're working with, and I'll get into this a little bit, we're working with Boston Public Schools, which is in the education sector. But in addition to them, we're working with philanthropic partners as well as eventually corporate partners across. So in that way, balancing political agendas as well as personal agendas to ensure that we continue to do what we said on the right here, to serve the people. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we aim to eradicate structural inequalities in this country. This is obviously a big, hairy, audacious goal. It's not something we're going to do quickly. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And the way we think we can do that is to use design to sort of bend the arc of complex systems. So that's what I was saying before. It isn't about designing inside a prescribed sandbox for a few months and then delivering a great idea and leaving, which is the standard design consultancy model. But we want to acknowledge that complex systems take time, energy, and the accumulation of social and political capital to affect change. I mean, we want to acknowledge that it takes a lot of effort and that you need to be embedded. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about the first project that we're working on. So we came out of the gate in April and immediately began working with Boston Public Schools on education here in Boston. We have basically two main thought partners within the city of Boston and Boston Public Schools. That's the superintendent of Boston Public Schools, Dr. Tommy Chang, his chief of staff, Makiba McCreary, and then in addition to that, the chief of education for the city of Boston, Ron Dorsey. And I'll show you a slide in a minute with all of their pictures. But yeah, so in order to do that, in order to begin this project, we started by looking in the organization itself, looking at management inside BPS. And so this is a representation of Boston's educational ecosystem. So the names hopefully are not too clear to you because we're trying to protect some people's identities, but it's all good. Essentially what you're looking at is both a map of the number of people and organizations. Triangles represent organizations, rectangles represent people that exist in Boston's educational ecosystem. There are some notable parts that are missing. I would say the charter schools and the parochial schools, partly because we haven't had a chance to get out there yet. This is also another way of thinking about this map is a representation of all the people that we're connected to, agency is connected to. These are people that we've had conversations with or that we spent significant amounts of time with. And you can see them sort of broken down by cluster or sector. So as I mentioned, when we began the work, really where we focused was on the parts that are still highlighted, with a big focus on BPS Central Office. We wanted to understand how the organization itself viewed itself and viewed its work and viewed its mandate, and then tried to understand within that who are the important players, and where are the points of leverage within that system that we can start to work with. So here again, these are some of the people that we spoke to. On the left is all the people within central office. In the middle is consultants or people outside of BPS proper. And then on the far right are the sort of initiatives and issues that we learned about. And ultimately, this also became our group. This is, in a way, the work that we're doing is trying to build networks within these systems that become sort of like SWAT teams that can really have an impact on affecting the work in a really meaningful way. So we've eventually ended up touching all 4 of those large buckets over there, which is Facilities Master Plan is looking 10 years into the future and trying to understand how Boston schools should be configured. The Strategic Implementation Plan is another way of thinking about that, but from the lens of instruction and how to get there. The Long-Term Financial Plan is the Long-Term Financial Plan. And then reconfigurations is the thing that nobody wants to talk about. That's closures and openings and new construction and all that stuff. And yeah, so the outcome of that first 4 months of work was a tremendous amount of research and analysis and synthesis of the system from the perspective of the ivory tower. So what management sees its job as, what management sees that it's doing. And the output was, there was a number of outputs. The most visible one was what you can see photos of here, which was a giant open house that took place in the new headquarters of Boston Public Schools in the Bowling Building. And this was essentially the way in which central office told its story of itself to all of its stakeholders. And we designed this entire thing. And so you can imagine that the 4 people on our team, me, my partner, our first employee, and our intern, sat in a room inside BPS for months and months and months, had about, as you saw, about 50 conversations with different people, synthesized all of the material that is BPS from a management perspective or from a documentation perspective, and represented it in the form of sort of dioramas and museum exhibitions and a lot of storytelling. And the outputs were really well received. It was a way to reframe sort of internal initiatives to model a new way of engaging with the community. So, there are little BPS, like many government institutions, is a little bit behind in terms of how to use social media and different communication methods in general. And then also, this is a traveling exhibition that will continue to move around the city in pieces for the coming year. It's also designed to be sort of updatable, so it's a framework that you can then update and change according to how your narrative as an organization is going to change in the future. And all that's great, super fun. We had a great time doing it. We had great conversations with people in the community, principals, teachers, etc. But really that's only half of the story. The other half of the story is, these people. Like, this is who we're really focused on. And so after we went through this long process of understanding from the perspective of central office what their job is, we really wanted to get out into schools and understand what the experience was, both for principals and teachers, who are really the direct link from education from the city's perspective to the students themselves. And so we visited, and so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand what it feels like on the ground. So again, if we're looking at that big org chart or map of the system, the parts that we're now talking about is all of this part. Each one of those little rectangles represents a school. The dark rectangle inside, sort of dark teal, represents a principal. And then this isn't even all of them. We went to 22 different schools. We spent a day in each school, so a solid month, actually 6 weeks, of visiting different schools. We tried to do a broad survey. So just to give you some background, Boston has about 128 schools from kindergarten through elementary schools, all the way up through high school vocational schools. We visited about 22, actually, so this number is incorrect. And we tried to do a broad survey, both geographically and in terms of level. So I don't know if you guys are aware, but public schools are ranked according to the test scores, standardized test scores of students who are attending them. Based on that, we kind of got this distribution. One of our tools, again, in our toolbox is using Google Maps to be able to sort of do analytics and also geotag and run everything. So here you can see the large circles represent the schools that we visited by TLT, which is, the district is so big that it's divided into smaller management sectors. But what you can see is we tried to be very evenly distributed across them, both geographically and typologically as well. And then, yeah, in schools, this is a very abridged version of who we spoke to. But predominantly different principals, teachers, administrators, and then of course all of the students that we spent time with as well. And you know, to be honest, like, we love this stuff. I mean, this is super duper fun. Like, you're out there at 6 a.m. and then you're watching kids get off the bus, and then you're going into class with them, and you're having recess, and then you're talking to the principal, and you're meeting with teachers. And you know, the perspective of a teacher or an administrator versus somebody sitting in remove out in the bowling building is so different. And understanding how the challenges that the system faces versus how an individual teacher or school faces, from those two perspectives is where we see a lot of design opportunities existing. So yeah, I'm not going to get into what we learned because there was a ton of stuff. But again, what you can see is that, you know, we really, this is where human-centered design became a big thing, where we were able to understand their experiences from as a teacher or as a student or as an administrator, translate those into a series of insights, and then from there develop a series of strategies around where we think opportunities lie. So again, phase 2 wasn't really about coming up with any design solutions, but phase 2 was really about understanding the situation so that we could develop a sense of where in the system there were opportunities to design. So what we're doing now is gearing up for design experiments in schools. And I can't really show you anything like that because we're in the process of working through those. But this is the same map represented in a slightly different way in order to understand where the most connections lie. And what you can see, and also to understand the kind of, I think, the mental model in which people establish hierarchies within the organization. At the very center of that is Dr. Tommy Chang. And what you can see is quite far off to the periphery are all of the different schools. And so our goal now is to go out and revisit some of the schools that we've been to, but also talk to people in the organization, identify who's going to be a suitable partner to do a design experiment, and then co-design those experiments with schools to uncover opportunities and levers across the entire system. So, you know, we want to create these kind of meaningful connections in the network so that people become empowered to be able to design their own solutions within the system, to navigate the system. So that's kind of it. I'll sum up by saying, you know, these are the sort of 3 phases of the project, and the different ways in which, the different sort of aspects of the work. So, you know, the first one is to really sort of, like a surveyor or a map maker, make a map, understand the system from above, and from the perspective of leadership, how the system is structured and the work that needs to be done. And the second phase of work, we're really trying to understand when you're standing there in the forest, looking out over the landscape, you know, what are the issues, and how are the issues that central office says from a top-down perspective, how are those actually felt from the ground, and how do you navigate those changes or needs? And then the third phase is really going to be designing changes in the organization that touch all levels of the system. So that representation is fairly accurate in that we believe that schools, as, you know, the mouthpiece of the system and also the point of contact between students and their education, need to be able to ripple change up into the organization to make the organization more able to serve the needs of students and teachers. So that's it.
Come on over and join our table. Well, first of all, I think it's probably clear to all of our students that this is a decidedly different twist than some, you know, the great thing about having so many different kinds of guests is that we get to see how design thinking can impact so many different types of creative endeavor. You know, I think obviously several of the guests in this course have been trained as architects, which is a particularly rigorous form of kind of problem solving, I think. And
Masochism.
Masochism. But it's really interesting to see you embarked on something that is trying to get much more to the core of a kind of fundamental, large-scale public matter. And that is not what, Roger Berkowitz is a totally lovely guy, but I mean, he's in the business of selling more fish, right? Like, that is job one.
Yeah.
And so nothing wrong with that, right?
No.
I mean, and adapting to a world where people eat out differently, where they consume food differently, and all the rest. But this is zooming out to if Roger Berkowitz has to get up to like 30,000 feet from time to time in order to survey the whole ecosystem of our overfishing versus dietetic needs and so forth, you're at about 100,000 feet saying, we're just going to look at the question of education. First of all, we're not even, it seems clear to me, and you stop me if I make a mistake here, that it's not that you have defined, the only problem perhaps that you have defined for purposes of this work on education is about understanding how people interact with this gargantuan system to start with. That's the first bit of research. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's not clear at all yet, necessarily, what changes that will result in terms of an eighth grader's education in Roxbury.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think one of the fundamental suppositions that we made through agency as well is that if you're living and working in an era or amidst very mature systems, the solutions are already out there. Somebody's already thought of it. And so what we also say is that we're interested in sort of de-fetishizing the new. We're not interested in building new things or finding, having this sort of sense of authorship in creating something new. I mean, if you look in the education space, for example, there are a million really brilliant people who are doing research, who are developing new curriculums, who are designing new schools that, they already exist. So our job is actually just to find the right one that will fit this particular context and then help them deploy it. And so even people within BPS, they know all of these great solutions. The challenges aren't around whether or not they want to. They have the will. A lot of it's just around the logistics. They can't get that shit done. It's really hard.
That's so impressive because, in another urban civic setting, I did some work with Tim Love, our mutual friend, a few years ago on about Boston City Hall, Plaza in general, Government Center in general. We had a little presentation about this a couple months ago that I gave in this class. But the issue was the urban design solution was the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah.
The question was the logistics of how, with overlapping ownership from the state, the federal government, the city, the T, how could you ever pull the trigger on even the most obvious, clear improvements?
Yeah.
So I do like the idea that de-fetishizing the new and really saying, no, really the problem perhaps is simply an organizational one, and that's where the systems comes in. So I want to ask you a little bit about, I appreciated very much the visualization diagrams, but we spoke a little bit, and I think you mentioned trying to identify inflection points in these complex systems. Can you tell us a little bit about how you go about doing that? Maybe it's the result of simply mapping lots of conversations, and if the same location in the system shows up, you've identified one.
Yeah, I think so a lot of this work is also, it's based in two kind of theoretical underpinnings. One is systems theory, which is a way of understanding, it comes from ecology, but it's a way of understanding the complex interaction between multiple systems. And the second is intersectionality. So intersectionality is this kind of, it was an academic term that was developed to try to understand how effectively black and brown boys or people were being negatively impacted by multiple systems collapsing on them at the same time. You live in a food desert, your neighborhood is crime-ridden, you can't get access to healthcare, therefore you can't get employment, therefore you're drawn to a life of crime. And all of these things create a sort of negative feedback loop. And so our perspective is, well, if there's a negative feedback mechanism that exists out there, there's got to be a way to undo some of that stuff and create positive feedback mechanisms in the same way. So points of inflection in the case of the systems that we're mapping, a lot of the times right now have to do with people, like identifying who is a player, basically, in the system who has leverage across multiple places. For example, you're not the chief of education, but you work in the city of Boston, and you're in the Office of New Urban Mechanics. Therefore, you touch housing and you touch education. If we can get it on your radar that by changing this one little thing, it'll have a positive impact for an entire school, you might do it. And the other thing is to appreciate that the points of inflection, what I was hoping for was, oh yeah, we're gonna make this big spider map, and then we're gonna look like the serial killer, and the red line's all gonna converge on this one place, and boom, we're gonna be done. And what's ended up happening is it's much more like sort of turning an oil tanker. It's little tiny conversations. So we have a conversation with the head of communications for BPS, and we say, hey, you know what? Your Twitter's a little janky. You might consider doing it this way instead. And then we set up this big exhibition, and the exhibition itself is interesting, but what was more effective was actually the individual conversations with different religious leaders across the city. And those small moments kind of ladder up to, we hope, bigger changes. And we're seeing it slowly already, but it takes time.
You know, in this particular season where we've seen significant political stuff going on, I couldn't help but think that, you know, when you talk about a nonprofit design consultancy where your client is the people, it sounds a lot like politics. And I guess I want to know if you have thought about it that way or not. In other words, some of the choices that you see as not optimizing our world, whether it's in education or transportation or media. Yes, lots of people point these things out, but the ultimate kind of adjudication of such things maybe is at the ballot box. And we just had a kind of surprising outcome, I think, for most people. And I'm just curious to know how you think about, and not to say that you shouldn't try to engage the very substantive issues that are the important issues of our day, but I'm just, you know, the name of your firm is agency. The idea, the concept of agency, or that is ability or author, or you know, the ability to influence something, either by statute or by virtue of resources or for whatever reason, seems to me it's kind of very paramount in your identity since it's named that. So, like, whence does agency derive its authority or its agency? Do you know what I'm saying? Where does your firm get its engine?
Where do we get the balls to do this?
Yeah, that's it, right.
We didn't know when we started. We definitely were very concerned about that. I would say that what we've discovered is that we get our authority and our ability, we get the permission to do what we do by doing really good work. So you know, what's interesting is that politics, education, transportation, another way of talking about the systems that we're dealing with is bureaucracy. And in a bureaucracy, it's not really about individual people being effective. You know, and this is a terrible generalization, but to a certain degree, a bureaucracy functions on everybody perpetuating the way the status quo.
Sure.
Like, I have to do this, you know, you have to fill out this form so that you can get this, and once you get that approved, you can go to this guy, and this guy can give you approval to do that. And what we're able to do is say, yeah, well, that seems like a kind of bullshit process that you need to engage in for whatever reason that you feel it's important to do that. But there's another way, and it kind of looks like this. And so even in our work with the city and with BPS, what we've discovered is that, for example, in a room of bureaucrats, everybody will say, you know, somebody needs to do something about this, but nobody will actually do it. And if we come to the table and we just say, hey, we did this. What do you think? that becomes a much more effective conversation starter and a way to get things moving.
But in a bureaucracy, and I've lived in Boston now for 30 years. I grew up in Chicago. I'm very familiar with the big city apparatus. But oftentimes, I remember talking with the former chief planner of the city, Kairos Shen, many times, and I said, "Hey, Kairos, I've got this incredible way to improve public review of complicated projects, and everybody says it's not transparent enough. Well, I've got this great way to make it super transparent, and by the way, it'll take 1/10 of the time." And he said, "Oh, grasshopper." he said, "You don't understand. It's supposed to take that long. In other words, we're not trying to make public engagement more efficient necessarily. The primary thing is that it has to feel to the public as though they have been consulted, and that takes a certain amount of time. So yes, we could do it this other way, but just so you know, we'd still have to have meetings for 18 months.
See, that's where how old is this guy?
He's between our ages.
Okay.
He's closer to mine.
Well,
but I know where you're going.
Right, so the times have changed, right?
Yeah,
I mean, in the age of social media, like Donald Trump can tweet out a bunch of lies that'll get more coverage than, I don't know, what's happening in Venezuela right now.
Right.
And so that's an opportunity area where I think bureaucracy is sort of falling behind in a way. Like, there's a way to engage the public in a way that is much more effective and much more immediate and visceral than is currently being explored. And so this kind of public engagement process is probably, you should talk to him again.
Yeah. Well, he's no longer the chief planner, and now
of the BPDA, right?
I'll be talking with Nigel Jacobs, whom you know, obviously.
Is he going to be the?
No, but he's the head of the Office of Urban Mechanics.
Right.
One of the things I thought we were going to talk a bit more about, you didn't show it in your slides, but I know that you're very involved with ideas about housing, social housing, and because of your experience both in China and the Netherlands, to say nothing of Canada, if you can't tell, he's Canadian, okay? Just FYI. So, view with a moderate level of suspicion. But the approaches to social housing in these 4 different places is, well, one is not like the other, I would say. That'd be the United States. And I just wonder, I can understand the frustration, for example, with how unresponsive American politics are to housing need, and a place like Boston, it's extreme, or San Francisco, it's extremely clear.
Yeah.
How would you guys approach this issue differently than you did when you were working, at an architecture firm?
Wow. Yeah, so I don't know if you saw, like, on one of the slides where I talked about the projects. This year and next year, for 2 years, we're going to be working in education space. The subsequent 2 years, we're thinking now that we're going to focus on the media. And then the subsequent 2 years after that, we'd like to get into housing.
Right.
And really because we need to ramp up to that.
Right.
Architecture, urban design in general are what I would call a MacGuffin. So it's Hitchcock had this, you know the term from Hitchcock. So do you guys know Hitchcock? Right, so Hitchcock had this idea for the MacGuffin. You guys know what a MacGuffin is? No? A MacGuffin is a plot device that serves no purpose other than to move the story along. Architecture and urban design is very much a MacGuffin. It's an expression of systems of power, edification of power, edification of structures that already exist in your society. So in the US context in particular, I would equally indict the Netherlands or France. Urban design was used as a tool for racial segregation. It's a very clear, it's a well-known fact. That's what it's for. And so in approaching an issue like housing, we appreciate that the housing project itself or the idea for it is an artifact of a much larger set of values and perspectives that informed how those decisions are made. And that's why I think housing is one that we're not going to attack right away. There's so many things, and we need so much knowledge to be able to do that.
Well, I agree. I mean, because I know more about housing and the systems behind it, maybe, I agree that it's challenging to think about using the language of design thinking. It's challenging in a way to define the problem of housing.
Yeah.
Because one could look through the lens of social, economic, or racial segregation. One could look through the lens of employment and the economy. One could look through any number of lenses in terms of how housing gets built now. And obviously, you know what I was alluding to when I said the United States is not like the others, in that we have generally public housing for poor people, but we don't have social housing in the sense that housing developed and owned by the state, in which people of all economic classes happily live in. Maybe the best example of that I'm aware of, you probably know more about these, is actually Singapore. Singapore has an unbelievably large percentage of its housing stock owned by the government, and everybody thinks of Singapore as such a laissez-faire, go-go capitalist enterprise, but actually, like 70% of the population lives in government-owned housing, which is kind of amazing. But anyway, the point is, those engines, the Singapore model, for example, and the Boston model, are completely different. They reflect a different set of interests in terms of the role of the government in something like this. And like, if I were going to try to put on your hat and attack the issue of housing in either place, I'm not sure I would know where to start, in a way. I guess you could start with the financial underpinnings of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I think you always start to a certain degree, or you end. I think the interesting thing, because when I look back on where I've lived versus, and through the lens of housing or through the lens of anything, Canada, China, the Netherlands, these are all socialist enterprises. And I think what's been really interesting about both working at Continuum, working in architecture for a little bit, and then also now in the work that we're doing, is that if you have to accept that we're in a deeply capitalist market society, and so any discussion about housing is going to start with a conversation about money. And what's interesting too is that even the structure of philanthropy is predicated upon a certain relationship between public good and private money. And so there's no,
But I mean, I guess I would take those in a way to be the design challenges. I mean, what do we do in this country? Well, in Boston, because we can't challenge that overarching sort of economic framework, we use percentage of affordable units. In Boston, if you build a luxury high-rise building, you're obliged to set aside, I think the floor now is 20% of the units as so-called affordable units. Now, they can be in the same building, or they can actually be off-site. In other words, it's really just money. It's just, and so there are trade-offs that take place, but this is how Boston subsidizes the housing market to the extent that it does, which is, many people would say, not sufficient, but that is a designed solution.
But that's a design for economic segregation too, right?
Sure, of course. I mean, now this is where, this could be a very wide-ranging conversation, but
they tend to be.
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, the whole idea behind bringing to bear your critical thinking to these issues is, in fact, to make them concrete, to concrete. All that mapping you're doing for the BPL is, or not BPS. BPS is about creating opportunities for discrete action, even if it's not proposing which discrete action it is yet. So when we talk about, housing, I mean, the truth is, it's not just some sort of system that is, the system, not to get too philosophical, is us. Lots of people want to live economically segregated from people who are a little bit poorer than they are.
Totally.
And they work hard to get a, and I'm not, that's the narrative. So I made enough money that I could move from Alston to, to Brookline.
And yet you see that people are making also the inverse choice, right? Like Cambridge, where I live, for example, people are living in these tiny little apartments, spending $750,000 to buy one floor condo in a 3-floor building because they acknowledge the vitality and the need for community.
Right.
So what's interesting is where in the Netherlands, for example, they mandated that you have to have a 30% mix of affordable, and then you also have to have these different incomes in every single building that you design. That was their social engineering, their endeavor for social engineering, because they recognized very early on that if you segregate people based on demographics or on class or on economics, what you're going to get is a breakdown of the social contract and a dissolution of civil society, so to speak. So they're coming to it here slower.
I mean, the irony is that, and I've lived in Cambridge for 30 years, and I'm not trying to make a political argument in either direction. What happens in progressive places like Cambridge or San Francisco, everybody wants the cost of that 1-floor, 1,000-square-foot unit that might be $750,000 today will be 1.25 in 5 years, and pretty soon it will only be wealthy people seeking community in Cambridge. Maybe that's already the case.
I think that's already the case.
Yeah. I mean, so the point is that it's complicated to mandate a kind of mixing using only public-private partnership kind of tools.
And I think that's where we hope our work is different in that, we can't mandate everything. We accept the boundaries of the system in which we live, that it's predominantly a market-driven economy, that urban planning has been the result, or has resulted in racial and economic segregation. And the challenge moving forward is how do we design within those constraints? And
so I've been trying to think, as we've been talking about, how I would describe what you're up to someone who asked me. And I think I might say, well, he doesn't call it this, but it's a social diagnostic operation, right? Like you go in, and your job is to try to identify sort of what are the underlying structures causing things to be as they are, because only if we understand what they are, can we then begin to think about, A, are we satisfied with the outcomes? B, if not, we now have some understanding of the architecture of the system.
Yeah.
And so that takes me back to this issue about inflection points. In your chart, this whole idea of systems, I'm just wondering, is it entirely, when we read Tim Brown, CEO of IDEO, he talks about how important observation is as opposed to just interviewing. And I'm sure you guys did this at Continuum too, where you just watch as people do any activity and you notice what things are terrible about the product, the experience, whatever it may be, that they wouldn't even tell you. They've internalized and just found a way to work around, and in fact, you could make their life much better even though they wouldn't even mention it to you.
Absolutely.
So, like, when it comes, so right now you're working on education and you showed us, but when it comes to, let's say, transportation, we just had Robin Chase, founder of Zipcar, but now her presentation wasn't really on Zipcar, because Zipcar was kind of the first step in an ongoing revolution.
Yeah.
Her conversation was entirely about autonomous vehicles and how, whoa, this is a total game changer, and it really, it was a very persuasive case to me. But as you guys approach transportation, I know that's not what you're doing now, but it's on the horizon. Maybe it was the fourth one?
I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. Yeah, you only have an 8-year plan for your.
Yeah, so the objective is to learn all of these different systems. We don't know the specific sequence. The part of the challenge in identifying the sequence is figuring out what relationships we're going to build. I mean, BPS comes out of a personal relationship or professional relationship, I should say, that started with my partner Augusta and myself. And so we were able to we're just able to get in at the right sort of altitude in the organization, so that we could have purview over what was happening and we could get access both up and down.
And we are at a moment, are we not, certainly in the government of the city of Boston, of tremendous transformation towards
Absolutely.
a more kind of innovation economy mindset, which is away from the hundreds of years old bureaucracy and towards we have got to innovate our way out of some of these problems, because there's not just going to be limitless amounts of dough. We've got to find a way to.
Well, that was the other thing too, like in terms of timing. We came in when Dr. Chang was within the first year of his administration.
Right.
Marty Walsh was in the second year of his administration. The entire executive cabinet of BPS is turned over. The BRA was undergoing significant renovation. So there's a lot of movement.
Reinvention.
In the system, which makes it more, gives it greater appetite for change.
Right.
Which we also got.
Now, do you have to? We talk about empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Well, when I assume that when you make a little, even if it's a small recommendation in this network of communication that is the whole school system, there's got to be some sort of metric associated with it. In other words, like did that school, did their performance get better? Did their attendance go up? Did their whatever it is that you're trying to correct for? I assume you have to find a way to document some of this stuff.
No, it's a really interesting point. We are not at the point where I think we can really effectively do that yet. I think in some areas, we see evidence but it's all kind of looking at it through a mirror. You know what I mean? You're kind of catching a glimmer of it. We know that one of the people in the communications department was hired because of us. We know that sort of Twitter traffic has changed because of us. Also the tenor of the conversation. But as people who are fundamentally interested in qualitative experiences, understanding that or being able to measure that is less clear on how we do that. Actually, it's interesting though, because we are currently working with the Opportunity Agenda, which is a giant conglomeration of philanthropic organizations who are focused on closing the achievement gap, predominantly for Black and brown boys. And they're metric crazy. So trying to understand from their perspective what the metrics were that would demonstrate improvement is something that we're very happy to be engaged with, because it hopefully will serve our work.
Well, I think that's one of our great design challenges, is always finding measurable things that track right alongside things that we've traditionally thought of as unable to quantify. Because we find this in universities all the time, that there's a qualitative improvement or a qualitative idea that does not lend itself to an Excel spreadsheet. And yet, in this innovation world that we live in today, one of the core things is ability to translate things into digital information. And so you got to find things that at least closely track those qualitative trends, it would seem to me. You know what I mean?
I think the trend right now in terms of education, as an example, would be they're moving away from standardized testing, and what they're interested in is in competency-based testing, or competency-based assessments. And so that means you're not actually running a test. It's basically you demonstrate mastery over this particular thing, then you can move on to the next level or whatever it is.
No, this is a huge trend actually in a lot of areas. Certainly in architecture, the accreditation of architecture schools went this way a long time ago. And it makes much more sense. In the old days, you would simply tell the accreditors what was on your syllabus. And whether you learned any of it or not was immaterial. Now it is entirely performance-based, which makes a lot more sense, but is more complicated. We've got to work at it to kind of test accurately. So I do have a couple more questions about what you do through the lens of design thinking. I won't lead with my own sense on this. I should ask you, how well did you feel that your training as a designer prepared you to really empathize with, like when you started at Continuum and now in your own enterprise, did you find that the demands of a designer were different than they were when you were an architect? I have a loaded reason for asking this question in the sense I don't think we do a very good job in architecture schools of teaching empathy.
It's not a part of your training as an architect.
Right.
I mean, I would say the people in school that I went to school with who were doing deeply empathetic architecture, like, there was always some person who did a senior housing project, like a senior home for somebody, and everybody else in the class was like, "You're crazy. Why are you, you should be designing a museum like me."
Yeah.
And that person was always kind of laughed out of the room.
Right.
Empathy, in terms of architecture, is something you either have or you don't have, and you can be trained into it, I believe. But it's not. I agree. It's not ensconced.
Right.
It's not edified in school as something that's important.
Whereas I assume when you got to Continuum, it was like, oh, okay. So instead of projecting what I think the right answer is onto our clients, I'm actually going to try to understand what their needs are.
Sure. The other way to look at it is to think about it in terms of, as an architect, you're thinking about building something that's going to last, hopefully, 50 years. Maybe 25, but hopefully 50 years or longer.
Right.
And so, to a degree, you have to not care how people live. Because you have to project into not just now, but how people are going to live.
Right.
In Continuum, the longest window we really ever looked at was 10 years out. And that was DHS, and that was like pie in the sky. We don't even know what the internet's going to be like in 10 years.
That's a really good point.
It's much closer in.
Right.
And as a result, you can use observations from now to inform design decisions, because it's going to take 2 years to roll out any kind of change anyway.
No, if you think about how people lived or how they would have responded to a survey in 1910 when most buildings in downtown Boston were being built, it was completely different. And how they were used. Yeah,
there was a relative amount of certainty, too, around how much it would change over the coming 5 or 10 years. Not that much.
Right. Great. Well, before I get to my last question, do we have any questions from the audience? Questions from you guys? Okay. So I want to close with a question about housing, again, just because we share an interest in it, I think. How would you define the problem of housing differently today than when you started your career? In other words, I don't know how, if you worked on housing at the very beginning of your career, I think you must have.
Yeah.
So how would you, when I say the problem of housing, that is the sort of front and center, top drawer issue that housing needs to address today versus when you started? Has this...
Like housing on what scale?
Well, let's say multifamily housing. In other words, when we talk about housing in this country, oftentimes people think, oh, a house.
Yeah.
But no, what I mean and what is meant in most other countries is 100, 200, 300 units of housing in some sort of configuration that has some amenities or that has it has some problem to solve. Either it's we need a place for young single people to live, or we don't have enough family for intergenerational housing. For example, in Asia, there's much more intergenerational housing than we have here. I mean, by a large factor. So I'm just curious if your interesting arc through designing in Europe and Asia, and then working in the human-centered design world, if that had altered your perception of it.
Well, I think that my perception of the issues that face housing have nothing to do with housing, have everything to do with people's cultural expectations of what a house is. So, I grew up in a house with a yard and a 2-car garage and all of that stuff, but I've never lived in one of those since I grew up in that place. And so I think the central thing about housing, as with everything, I think, is not about anything wrong with it. It has more to do with what you're able to accept as a person.
Right.
So it's sort of changing your own, changing what your expectations are of a house. So you see that too. You see that in Cambridge, where people who no doubt grew up in the same sort of conditions that I grew up in are choosing to live in 1,100 square feet with 2 kids and 2 adults and a pet, because they believe that community is more important than
Right.
square footage.
Right, right.
So I don't actually, I would say that in terms of multifamily housing here, I think it gets very technical, and I think that's it's very interesting, but it's very technical. So,
Right.
for example, solid wood construction or tunnel construction, which is big in Europe, is not really up to code here in the same way, at the same scale. And so that's a barrier to building at scale with the kind of differentiation and personalization and sort of variegation in the forms that you would hope for, and that create interesting places to live and to walk around in.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's an architecture question. You
Yeah,
can design your way out of it.
yeah, yeah. Okay, well, Jason Lee, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.